C18 came in this week. Prior to that, C11, which was a year ago called C10 before the government fell, was reintroduced. We've still got the online harms bill to come. The government seems very determined to control the internet, and that kind of makes me sad because the internet is such a dynamic and wonderful thing. Yes, it has problems. Yes, there are issues with it. Yes, there are areas that, in terms of privacy, data collection, and that sort of stuff with big tech that you want to look at for regulation. But these guys are kind of funny. They keep saying that free speech will be protected in one breath, and in the next breath they say, well, we have to do this to stop disinformation. So one of the things you have to live with free speech is a certain amount of disinformation. So there you go. That's you're looking down three barrels at the moment, and I'm really quite concerned that the interaction between funding for media and that sort of stuff is going to interfere with the debate.
Well, that's something I was kind of ranting about before. I mean, in a bit of a self-serving way, but it's the truth. What you're going to be beholden to whoever pays your bills, and if that turns out to be the government at some point, well, then chances are you're going to be a lot less inclined to be critical of the government at the time because you just don't want that boat to be rocked.
Right. I mean, Bill C18, for your viewers and listeners who aren't familiar with it, it forces big tech companies like Facebook and LinkedIn and Google to pay money to news organizations. Not just any news organizations, but approved news organizations. That the federal government has set up a panel to approve what is a real news organization and what isn't a real news organization. That's you guys applied for that just to see what would happen. You got a couple raised eyebrows, but a nod, and then you politely declined to take the cash, which I think speaks well of you, because as a former newspaper man, I'm shocked at the extent to which today's publishers are willing to accept this contradiction in their independence, to their independence like that. Anyway, C18 forces the Facebook, etc., to feed money to these companies for a fantasy commercial exchange, and it really puts the big publishers in the pocket of the government, in not directly, but indirectly enough that it's going to undermine their credibility with their readers and listeners.
Well, absolutely. I mean, they're kind of pointing out, some pointed back and said, well, I see the standard qualified, they're not unfair as a committee. But the thing was, if we had accepted that, and then we became dependent on that shakedown, as the term has been put, for the social media giants to get that money, well, we are always going to be fearful, though, of losing our status as an approved media outlet. So, I mean, if that rug could be yanked out from under us at any given time, we're not going to be fully independent, and we're going to always have that in the back of our minds, even if unintentional, when reporting on anything, and that's not good.
Yeah, and even if you are pure as the driven snow, people who consume your product will wonder if you are, right? So, like, these conflicts of interest, like, really interesting. Going back, been involved in a few of these. You hear people say, "Hey, I know when I'm in a conflict of interest. I'm okay. It doesn't matter that." This story is about the priest at the church I went to. I can still report on it fairly. Well, perhaps you can. But the point is, you should not, because other people will think you can't. And that's the way conflict of interest works. So that's what happens with these sort of connections, where you are always thinking about it in the back of your head. And it informs your behavior, right? I mean, one of the things with C18 as laid out, right? The Facebook, let's use Facebook as an example, has to come to an agreement with, call it the National Post, right? And as part of that agreement, they have to assure that the money they are sending them is spent on national, Canadian news, right? And then after that, the CRTC has to approve that agreement, right? So just like you said, when you're building that agreement about how that money gets spent, you're going to build it knowing that you are seeking the CRTC's approval, right? So you essentially, through this system, whether intended or otherwise, you have the behaviors of the newsrooms of the nation being they are they are being overseen by an arm of government, and I just find that no matter how benign the intentions, I just find that terrifying.
Well, that's it. And I mean, any developed democracy always will have a clause somewhere in their constitution or their charter or whatever, making sure to protect free press. I mean, they recognize how important it is to have media feel comfortable with the ability to be critical of their own government. If you lose that, you can be into a great deal of trouble. And of course, whether well-meaning or not, authoritarian regimes do not like a free press. So thus, that's one of the first things they'll always control.
Yeah, and when we get into this, we're talking about sort of misuse of language, right? This is a free and independent media. Everybody says that, right? Um, our media are free and independent. Russia TV, was in the news recently. RTV, right? I mean, the Russians claim it's a free and independent media. One of the things we have to be careful about when we do these things is, well, we may assume that we have the high moral ground on things, and that we do is that we are not using the exact same arguments as other nations who are less democratically inclined than, say, we are, and think it's okay because we're better. The argument is either good or the argument is bad. So you either have an independent press or you don't. Just because you're getting your money from a Justin Trudeau government as opposed to a Vladimir Putin government doesn't mean you're not taking the government's money.
Well, that's it. And we're in a period of great flux. And I mean, I understand people are also mistrustful of some of these social media giants. I mean, they exert a great amount of influence on the information that's going out and our abilities. Facebook frustrates us to no end with the Western Standard because they're very essential to us to be able to share our stories to a broad audience. Uh, but at the same time, it's a symbiotic relationship. I mean, we're providing content for them, it's good for them, and they provide a platform for us to share it out. But we can be pushed around a bit by some of those bigger ones as well. But I mean, letting those relationships evolve on their own, we should be able to let the chips fall the right way. We don't need the government in there stirring it up in the meantime.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, you raise a good point there, and you raise one in which I think there's a legitimate case for some oversight, not by the government itself, but from an arm's length agency. And like I'm a senior fellow with the Macdonald Laurier Institute, and my former chairman at the CRTC, Conrad von Finkenstein, is a senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute. And we actually created a policy paper that said, okay, if you're going to do this stuff, this is how you should do it. And we called it the Social Media Responsibility Act. And the idea behind that is to make sure that companies like Facebook, who are, let's face it, are in a pretty dominant position in the marketplace, right? It's not a full monopoly, but it's as close as you're going to get, right? If you want to reach audiences, you don't have too many options other than to go through Facebook. It's to make sure that they're behaving themselves and they're treating everybody equally and fairly, and they're upholding free speech. That's a different approach than the one that Canadian Department of Heritage has been taking, which is much more hands-on. We want to make our suggestion is that if you're going to regulate the internet, you make sure that you regulate not the internet, but these large dominant companies, to make sure that they are treating people fairly and giving everyone an equal voice. So if you get booted off for saying something bad, somebody on the other end of the spectrum gets booted off for saying the same thing that's bad. You have the same rules and the same application of the rules.
Yeah, which is always difficult to come up with, but not impossible. Media though is in a general period of flux. We're in a transition right now that we've never seen before. The conventional outlets are having a very hard time. There's no denying that. I mean, I've talked about that before. The advantages we've set up, at some degree of expense, a studio and a broadcast and a publication now and everything, which took some investment. but I mean, not even a tiny fraction of what it would have cost 20 years ago if you wanted to open a television studio or a printing press or things like that. So, I mean, the older institutions and the mainstream media outlets that still have those large infrastructure and overhead, they are having a really hard time competing with outlets like ours right now. And again, I mean, I'm a free market guy. I just kind of say let the chips fall where they may, but it still is putting a lot of pressure on the entire industry right now. How can we work with that transition, perhaps?
Oh yeah, I mean we're going through a transition right now that's every bit as profound as the invention of the printing press, right? I mean, people need to get their heads around that. There's a lot of people in the traditional fields who are kind of like, well, this is like the new, internet. This is like the new cable, or is this what this? No, this is something entirely new, right? And it's had a devastating effect on the old newspaper industry and that sort of stuff. So if governments are looking to support, if people are worried about the state of journalism, which is a legitimate worry, I mean, you can worry about it for all kinds of reasons, but if you're worried about it, it having a financial foundation, what you should be investing in, or what you should be getting out of the way of, and this is, I'm a bit more like you in this, is where can government get out of the way, right? And allow for innovation to flourish, right? So like your media, and there's some others around, it'll work or it won't. Nobody knows yet, but you probably are adjusting things all the time on the way you go. But you are innovating, you are being entrepreneurial. And that's what you need to do. What the government's doing right now with C18 is it is propping up clearly failed business models. What it should be doing, if it does anything, is getting out of the way of innovation for innovators such as yourself, and also seeing if helping these guys transition into whatever it is that's going to work for the next stage. But all that big old infrastructure, all those expensive collective bargaining agreements, they're not sustainable.
No, we just have to accept that it's going to change, and some people have to flex. And there's still room for some great media professionals. I mean, it's worked in our benefit in some ways. We've gotten a hold of Dave Naylor here in our newsroom, and we have columnists, people you've worked with, familiar with, such as Makachuk and others. And they've moved on to the new format right now, though it's still difficult because, I mean, it's not as lucrative as it used to be. I mean, one of the things people forget is classified ads that you would know as well as anybody. That was a huge part of the revenue stream for newspapers, and they're gone now, and they got to figure out how to cope with that.
Oh, and they've been gone for a long time. Classified basically paid for the newsroom, right? In terms of profit, and maybe even more than that, right? So losing that, and that's like a remarkable, right? Because it's initially you were losing it to other online, revenue or companies and that sort of stuff who were still charging. And then Kijiji came along and it's given it away for free. How do you compete against that? Here you've got something that, job ads, the employment section, that sort of stuff. Those are all new things. Attaching a subscription to things and proving your value to readers is really important. It seems to be working. You guys do it. Nobby's putting the old band back together, all that sort of stuff, right? So, yeah, I mean, keep innovating. That's what new companies should be doing. One of the things that concerns me about C18 is that by propping up the failed business models, they're actually handicapping entrepreneurs like you.
Yeah, well, and slowing that evolution. I mean, to a degree, you could think it's doing a disservice to some of the established journalists who, unfortunately, might have to move on from those legacy outlets, but they delay it too long. I mean, it's a boat that's sailing. I used the analogy the other day. I mean, I started in the conventional survey industry. I had to learn optical survey and all of that, and then GPS came along and wiped out all my training. A guy could learn in 20 minutes, with a digital unit, what took me years of getting abused by a surveyor to figure out how to do with a transit. But your options as a surveyor were to embrace GPS and move on to the new technology, or be left behind. And if somebody had artificially held up the old survey sort, some guys would have stuck with it, but they would have paid a bad price for it in the long run.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got to be able to change, and it's very. I remember when I was in the newspaper business, somebody used to say, the moment you see a trend arrive on the pages of a newspaper, it's over. Which was like, they were big, like oil tanker type very vehicles. They're very powerful, very strong, very, very rich. at their time, but they were pretty hard to turn around in a hurry in terms of that. So, I mean, the dinosaur analogy isn't fair, but well, in a sense, it is. I mean, it wasn't the dinosaur's fault that the asteroid hit, right? And the internet is the asteroid that hit the newspaper industry. There's no doubt about that. I think there's always going to be a market for good, fair, unbiased news. I think people really need to get back to their basics and become reporters. There's way too much journalism going on, activism blended and that sort of stuff. People always just wanted, tell me what happened and let me make up my own mind, right? That's always what worked. There's no reason why it can't work again. And if people get back to that straight news, let it go. There's a lot of young people running around Parliament Hill right now. That's their first job. I'm not sure if they can, I don't want to insult some of them, but certainly all of them, but there's some of them that I'm not sure you could trust to cover a motel fire. It's a craft. You need to get good at it. It's not, you're not on a mission to do anything other than gather the facts and present them in a fair and unbiased fashion to your audience. I think that's the prayer people should hold to.
Yeah, well, and those principles can be reestablished with new outlets and new outfits. Like here, I won't write a paragraph of news copy. I'm not appropriate for it or capable of it. I'm an opinion guy. And likewise, as you said, Nobby keeps a high standard and makes sure that all of our reporters are sticking to journalistic standards. And, if we can do that, other outlets can. And that's part of what's been our success so far.
Yeah, and I mean, all of this funding going to what we call legacy media and the big companies, Bell and Shaw and Rogers and I mean, Bill C18, the biggest beneficiary of that is going to be the CBC, which isn't an extremist at all.
Oh.
How does that work? I mean, you're creating a fund to help people who are, whose businesses are dying, and the CBC comes along, all of a sudden just bellies up to the bar and says, make that around for me as well, right? Away you go. But there might be some advantage to entrepreneurs like Western Standard now to be able to label yourself as, we don't take the money.
Yeah.
We are unapproved. We don't count. The only approval we want is from readers. We don't care about the government's approval. You'll do so at some expense to yourself, but that's short term, and long term, it might actually really work for you.
Yeah, well, I like to think it's going to benefit us much more than any expense. Yeah, the short-term pain. So, in kind of closing up, though, we've got all these bills. They're pending right now. As you said, it's a multi-front thing. We got C11, we got C18. With the Liberal NDP coalition, it's pretty likely they're going to pass without issue. How can we fight back against this?
Well, I think there's still some opportunities left in the committee process, right? There's when you get into that, it's not like question period where politicians have to perform theatrics. And I have seen in the past, once they get into the committee process and people start proposing amendments, that there are points at which somebody might say, you kind of got a point there, right? We can reword this to this and that. So the legislation will pass, maybe with some impact, but I mean, people should do their best to follow this, make noise with their MPs and make noise with Heritage Canada and other places, and even with their local media, who are benefiting from this, and ask for more information. It's been kind of frustrating for somebody like me I realize I'm really close to it, and there's some sort of risk of me coming across as too policy wonky. But like, if people can get that upset about wearing a mask, how can you not get upset about losing your freedom of speech? How can you not get upset about your media, right? Taking money from the government, being dependent on the government, right? Like, I'm not saying being upset about a mask doesn't have value or isn't purposeless, but it's temporary, right? This other stuff is going to last for a very long time, and will have a creep to it that is worrisome.
Well, yeah, it's always a lot harder to get rights back than it is to give them away.
Oh yeah, once they're out the door, they're gone.
Well, we'll see how it all develops. It's troublesome, but I mean, I'm looking still to the future with a lot of optimism. I mean, we're doing well. We'll keep pushing through no matter what, as will a number of other outlets and people with, an integrity and ambition. But just might be some bumps in the road along the way. So I
Well,
appreciate you.
keep your head up, because C11 applies to all online audio and video.
Oh, I know. I'm watching it
That's
close.
what we just did.
And I'm not always one who's unafraid to ruffle some feathers with stuff I do. And there's that risk. I could tick off the wrong person, and something gets interpreted through that, and suddenly they pull the plug on our broadcast. I do worry about that, but I can't let that change how I'll approach things, or there just won't be much point to the show anymore.
That's right.
I really, as I said, appreciate your voice. How can people find out more information? You're with the MacDonald Laurier Institute as well. I mean, when I was trying to look up the one-line description of what you're up to these days, it was just so long. But you're a busy man.
Oh, yeah, on there. No, I usually just go with former newspaper executive and past CRTC vice chair. That tightens it up. That tightens it up a little bit. I would encourage people to, go online and go to places like michaelgeist.ca. Michael's a law professor at the University of Ottawa and the Canada Research Chair in Internet Law. And he is a very articulate critic of this, and he manages to analyze it legally, but still make his analyses accessible to those of us among the great unwashed when it comes to that sort of stuff. So Michael's actually very good at translating things like that. I expect there will be some reporting in platforms such as your own, independent platforms. Blacklock's Reporter is another one. I think The Line is another group that's not taking the money. So find the truly independent media and look for commentary and stories on those posts, because I'm afraid we can't expect right now within our major media to see much pushback on any of these bills.
No, unfortunately. And as you said, that's that consequence perhaps of making them a bit dependent on that in the first place, which is sad to see.
It is. And it's sad to see that they're actually so desperate that this is happening too. Nobody wants to see that happen. Nobody likes to see people get laid off. Nobody likes to see companies fail.
No, and that's why I hope, and I like talking about a transition rather than the dynamiting of an old institution. And I do, I get on the case of establishment media a lot, but I do like to put out the caveat now and then. There's still some very fantastic skilled journalists out there in those legacy outlets, including even the CBC. I just wish they would move on to private ventures.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's some really, really good journalists, and like the old phrase used to be, newspapers don't report when airplanes land safely. So people don't react when they see good journalism as much as they react when they see bad journalism, right? So it makes me angry, I guess. It makes me frustrated, or I'm disappointed is probably a better way to say it, when I see bad journalism, because it drags down the good ones. And there are a lot of good ones. And as you said, including at the CBC. So we need to make sure they make it through this. Absolutely.
Well, again, I really appreciate you joining us today. I hope we get the chance to talk again soon. Maybe we'll have a positive development in media to discuss at that time.
No, we'll continue to make sure this works.
Right on.